Rain fell softly over Manhattan on the night the Blue Phoenix diamond vanished. And for exactly 12 seconds, the most secure ballroom in the city went completely dark. When the lights returned, $4 million in blue diamond had disappeared from a case that had not been touched by human hands in over 3 hours. Every eye in the room turned toward one man standing near the exhibit, a quiet security director named Ethan Cole. Before hundreds of the wealthiest guests in New York, a woman in a crimson gown raised her hand and pointed directly at him, declaring in a voice that trembled with practiced outrage that he was the thief. No one in that glittering room knew she had built the trap herself, piece by piece, over many months. And no one knew that the man she had just accused had once hunted criminals exactly like her for a living. The ballroom of the Ashcroft Hotel had been transformed for the evening into something resembling a cathedral built entirely of light. Crystal chandeliers hung above marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and waiters in white gloves moved silently between tables draped in ivory silk. The charity auction had drawn nearly 400 guests, among them senators, art dealers, tech founders, and old money families whose names had been carved into the city for generations. At the center of the room, beneath a cone of soft white light, sat the Blue Phoenix, a diamond the size of a robin's egg, valued at $4 million and insured for even more. Ethan Cole had walked the perimeter of that room 17 times since 6 o'clock that evening, checking sensors, testing sightlines, and speaking quietly into a small earpiece connected to his security team below. Ethan was 39 years old, and there was a stillness to him that most people mistook for shyness. He wore a simple black suit that fit him without drawing attention, and he moved through the crowd the way a man moves through a house he has lived in for years, without wasted motion. Few of the guests knew his name. Fewer still knew that he had once carried federal credentials, that his signature had once appeared on warrants that dismantled smuggling networks worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had left that life behind 5 years earlier, after his wife died, and had rebuilt himself quietly as the head of security for one of the most prestigious auction houses on the East Coast. He preferred it that way. He preferred rooms where nobody asked questions about his past. Victoria Harrington noticed him almost immediately. She was 38, striking in the deliberate way of a woman who had spent 2 decades perfecting every detail of her appearance, and she moved through the ballroom on the arm of her husband as though she owned the air itself. Richard Harrington, 62, a real estate billionaire whose name sat on 3 towers along the Hudson River, adored her without question. He had built his empire on instinct and trust, and he extended both freely to his wife, never once suspecting that the woman beside him had married him not for love, but for access. Victoria drifted toward Ethan twice that evening, asking pointed questions about the camera network, the timing of the guard rotations, and whether the vault beneath the ballroom could be accessed without a secondary key. She smiled the entire time, and Ethan answered every question politely, filing each one away in the back of his mind, the way a man files away a splinter he intends to deal with later. At 11:14 that evening, the lights failed. The backup generators, which should have restored power within 2 seconds, took 12. In that narrow window of darkness, a sound like glass shifting against velvet passed almost unnoticed beneath the sudden murmur of 400 confused voices. When the chandeliers flared back to life, the Blue Phoenix was gone, and the reinforced case that had held it sat open, its lock mechanism untouched, its alarm silent. Security guards rushed toward the stage. Guests began to whisper, then to shout. And within 90 seconds, the ballroom had descended into the particular chaos of wealthy people who had never once in their lives been told to stay calm. It was Victoria who spoke first, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise like a blade through silk. She said the men should look at the security director, that he had been standing closest to the case when the lights went out, that something about his manner all evening had felt wrong to her. Heads turned. Cameras that had been filming the auction for a charity broadcast swung toward Ethan's face. He stood perfectly still amid the accusation, watching Victoria with an expression that gave nothing away, while somewhere behind his calm eyes a very old and very careful part of his mind began, quietly, to work. Hotel staff scrambled to secure the exits, while a manager pleaded for calm through a microphone that kept cutting in and out. And somewhere near the bar, an elderly collector fainted from the shock of watching $4 million evaporate in front of her eyes. Guests pulled out their phones, capturing everything: the trembling case, the empty velvet cushion, the man standing frozen beneath the chandelier while accusations rippled outward from where Victoria stood. A member of the auction house's board demanded the doors be locked immediately so that no one could leave, and for nearly 20 minutes, 400 of New York's wealthiest citizens stood confined together in a ballroom that had transformed, in the span of a single blackout, from a celebration of art and philanthropy into something closer to a crime scene. The hotel's internal footage told a story that seemed impossible to dispute. Ethan had been the last person recorded standing within 3 feet of the display case before the blackout began. His access badge logged at the precise console that controlled the vault's secondary lock. When investigators dusted the case for prints, his were the only ones found, layered fresh over the glass. His personal key card, the one issued only to senior security staff, showed a swipe at 11:13, 60 seconds before the power failed. Every fact, when placed beside another, formed a chain that pointed in a single direction, and that direction led straight to the man now standing motionless in the center of the ballroom. Detectives who arrived to secure the scene noted immediately how thoroughly the crime seemed to have been staged for maximum public humiliation, as though whoever orchestrated it wanted not simply to steal a diamond, but to destroy a specific man's reputation in front of the largest possible audience. A hotel executive, eager to protect the establishment's reputation, quietly pressured officers to close the case swiftly, reminding them that half the guests in that ballroom sat on boards that funded major portions of the city's cultural institutions. Under that kind of pressure, thoroughness became a luxury nobody in the room seemed willing to insist upon, and the fastest available explanation, however incomplete, became the only one anyone seemed interested in pursuing. Richard Harrington's face had gone the color of ash. He had personally approved Ethan's hiring 2 years earlier, had shaken his hand at company events, had trusted him with the security of collections worth tens of millions of dollars. Now he stared at the man as though seeing a stranger for the first time, betrayal curdling into fury with astonishing speed. When 2 uniformed police officers arrived 11 minutes later, summoned by hotel management, Richard was the one who demanded they act immediately, his voice booming across the marble floor with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The officers approached Ethan without hesitation, reciting his rights while 400 guests watched in silence, broken only by the click and flash of phones capturing the moment. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists in full view of senators and socialites, of art dealers and heiresses, of a woman in a crimson gown, who watched the scene unfold with an expression of practiced sorrow that masked something closer to triumph. Within hours, the story had spread across every major news outlet in the city, and by morning, headlines had already crowned him with a title designed to be remembered. "Federal agent turned thief," one read. And the phrase spread with the particular cruelty reserved for men whose fall from grace makes for good television. Strangers who had never met him felt free to condemn him, certain of his guilt, because certainty required no evidence beyond a headline and a photograph of handcuffs catching the light. Colleagues who had worked beside him at the auction house for years spoke to reporters about a man they suddenly claimed to have always found strange, memories reshaped overnight by the convenience of hindsight and the comfort of aligning with public opinion. A former neighbor described him as quiet and private, in a tone that made privacy itself sound suspicious, while a morning talk show devoted an entire segment to speculating about what other crimes a man with his particular set of skills might have committed and gotten away with over the years. Nobody paused to ask why a man clever enough to once dismantle international smuggling rings would leave his own fingerprints so carelessly across the scene of his supposed crime, because that question complicated a story that was, for the moment, far more satisfying left simple. What confused the detectives assigned to the case was not Ethan's guilt but his silence. A man accused of stealing $4 million in front of hundreds of witnesses should have protested, should have wept, should have insisted on his innocence with the desperate energy of someone watching his life collapse. Ethan did none of these things. He sat in the interrogation room, with his hands folded on the metal table, and when the lead detective slid the case file toward him, and asked if he had anything to say. Ethan simply asked to see the raw footage in its original, unedited form. The request unsettled everyone in the room. Because innocent men usually pleaded and guilty men usually lied, and Ethan's calm request for evidence fit neither pattern the detectives had spent their careers learning to recognize. Victoria, informed of his composure through a phone call from a hotel executive, allowed herself a small, private smile. She had planned every detail of that evening for months, and a man's silence, she believed, was simply the sound of a trap closing exactly as intended. She had no reason yet to suspect that the silence she mistook for defeat was, in fact, the opening move of a much older and far more dangerous game. 2 days after his arrest, released on bail, arranged by a lawyer who had once served alongside him in federal service, Ethan sat in a small holding room, waiting to be processed out, when a familiar face appeared at the door. Detective Mason Brooks, 47 years old, had spent 6 years working joint task forces with Ethan back when both men wore federal credentials and chased smugglers through shipping lanes and customs warehouses. Mason studied his old colleague for a long moment before speaking. His expression caught somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. He asked Ethan directly whether he had taken the diamond, the way one professional asks another when politeness has become a luxury neither of them can afford. Ethan met his gaze without flinching and told him that whoever had orchestrated this had far more to hide than a single stone worth $4 million, that this was never about the diamond at all, that someone was using the theft to bury something larger. Mason had known Ethan long enough to recognize the particular stillness in his voice. The same stillness he used to carry into interrogation rooms when he already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Mason left that first meeting unconvinced but curious, and curiosity, in a detective as experienced as he was, had a way of becoming action. He pulled the original case file that evening, reading through statements taken from guests, staff, and hotel security in the hours immediately following the theft, and found himself troubled by small inconsistencies nobody had thought to flag. 2 guards reported hearing a faint mechanical sound moments before the blackout began, a detail omitted entirely from the official summary handed to reporters. A junior technician mentioned, almost in passing, that the backup generator had been serviced only 2 days earlier by a contractor nobody at the hotel could clearly identify. None of it proved anything on its own, but together the details formed the unmistakable outline of a story more complicated than the one already being told on every television screen in the city. While the public devoured headlines painting him as a disgraced federal agent who had finally succumbed to greed, Ethan spent his nights working through documents Mason had quietly shared with him, records that painted a far more complicated portrait of the evening. He noticed something the original investigators had missed entirely. A secondary camera feed mounted above the loading dock that had also gone dark during those 12 seconds, though it operated on a completely separate power grid from the ballroom. Coincidences like that did not occur naturally. Not in systems built with the redundancies Ethan himself had designed. Somewhere behind the elegant surface of that auction house, someone with real technical knowledge had orchestrated a blackout precise enough to fool 400 witnesses and an entire police department. Victoria Harrington's world, meanwhile, was far less serene than the one she presented to her husband and their social circle. Beneath the diamonds and the designer gowns and the charity board memberships lay a debt so large it threatened to collapse everything she had spent 2 decades building. She owed a staggering sum to a man named Damian Cross, a figure who moved through the international diamond trade the way a shark moves through open water, unseen until the moment he chose to be seen. The debt had begun as a series of private investments gone catastrophically wrong, hidden from Richard through offshore accounts and forged signatures. And it had grown, with interest, into a number that could no longer be concealed through clever bookkeeping alone. The theft of the Blue Phoenix had never been about a single stolen diamond sitting in a velvet case. It was the opening move in a much larger scheme, one designed to funnel stolen gemstones through Damian's network, launder the proceeds through a web of shell companies, and ultimately allow Victoria to file a devastating insurance claim on jewelry that had, in truth, already been quietly replaced with flawless replicas months earlier. The real Blue Phoenix had left the building long before the blackout, smuggled out during a maintenance visit disguised as routine appraisal work. What vanished during those 12 seconds of darkness was simply the final piece of theater, a spectacle designed to provide cover for a crime that had already been completed in the shadows. And Ethan, with his federal training and his uncomfortably sharp instincts, had always represented a liability to that plan. Victoria had studied him for weeks before the auction, watching the careful, methodical way he inspected every camera angle and every access point, and something in his manner had told her he was not the kind of man who accepted easy explanations. Framing him accomplished two goals at once, removing the one person capable of unraveling her scheme, while simultaneously providing the perfect scapegoat for a crime that had already taken place. She had believed, with the confidence of someone who had never truly been caught at anything, that a former agent 5 years removed from federal work would be too rusty, too broken by grief and disgrace, to see the trap closing around him. She could not have been more wrong. Victoria's rise into the world of old money had never been accidental. She had arrived in New York in her early 20s with little more than sharp instincts and a talent for reading people, working her way through a series of jobs that placed her in proximity to wealth long before she ever possessed any herself. Her marriage to Richard, 10 years her senior, had been framed publicly as a great romance. But privately, it had always functioned as a transaction, a young woman trading beauty and charm for permanent access to a fortune she intended to control, long before she ever intended to love. The debts to Damien Cross had begun quietly. Disguised as investment opportunities, she assured herself she could manage without her husband ever learning. And by the time she understood how deeply she had entangled herself, a retreat was no longer an option available to her. Ethan's history, buried deep beneath years of quiet civilian life, told a very different story than the one the tabloids had constructed. He had spent nearly a decade as a federal agent, specializing in financial crimes and international diamond trafficking, and during that time, he had built a reputation within certain circles as a man who never stopped pulling a thread once he found the end of it. He had once led an investigation that dismantled a smuggling operation responsible for moving hundreds of millions of dollars in conflict diamonds through New York and Antwerp, an operation that had, at its center, a young and ambitious trafficker named Damien Cross. Colleagues from that era still remembered Ethan as a man who slept only a handful of hours a night while chasing a lead, who could sit with a single ledger for 11 straight hours until a pattern finally surfaced from the numbers, who never once raised his voice because he understood that patience frightened guilty men far more than anger ever could. That case had ended Damien's American operations for years, cost him nearly everything he had built, and forced him into a long, patient exile from the very city where Victoria now unknowingly needed his help. Damien believed, until very recently, that the agent who had once destroyed his network had long since retired into obscurity. And Victoria had never known his name at all, had never bothered to ask the questions that might have revealed how dangerous the man she was framing truly was. During the weeks he spent suspended from his position, publicly disgraced and privately furious, Ethan did not waste a single hour feeling sorry for himself. Instead, he returned again and again to the technical bones of the crime, studying secondary camera systems, cross-referencing badge access logs against server timestamps, and analyzing the subtle temperature fluctuations recorded inside the display case in the hours before the theft. What he found, piece by piece, was a picture entirely different from the one presented in court documents. The temperature sensors inside the case showed a brief anomaly nearly 6 weeks before the gala, consistent with the case being opened and resealed by someone with expert-level access far earlier than anyone had previously considered relevant. Backup server logs, recovered through a friend who still worked in the auction house's technical department, revealed that footage from that 6-week window had been quietly deleted and reconstructed using looped segments designed to appear seamless to a casual observer. Ethan understood, with the cold clarity of a man returning to the only skill he had ever truly mastered, that the diamond had likely never left the building on the night everyone believed it disappeared. It had been gone long before the blackout ever began. Late one night, alone in his apartment with case files spread across a kitchen table he had not used for a proper meal in weeks, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment to think about his late wife, about how she used to tell him that his greatest strength was also his loneliest habit, the refusal to let a puzzle rest until every piece fit. She had died 5 years earlier after a long illness, and her absence was the real reason he had walked away from federal work, unable to summon the same hunger for justice once the person he most wanted to come home to was gone. Sitting there now, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy built to destroy him, he felt something stir that he had not felt in years. Not vengeance exactly, but a quiet, stubborn insistence that the truth deserved to be found, regardless of who tried to bury it. With that revelation anchoring his investigation, Ethan began working quietly alongside Mason, feeding him carefully verified pieces of evidence, rather than wild accusations that could be easily dismissed. Lena Foster, a 34-year-old investigative journalist who had built her career exposing corruption among the city's wealthiest families. In place, what she found in public records alone was troubling enough. A pattern of offshore transfers routed through accounts registered in the Cayman Islands, timed suspiciously close to major purchases and renovations at the Harrington estate. Richard, for his part, began noticing small fractures in the version of events his wife had presented to him. Inconsistencies in her timeline for the evening, a phone call she claimed never happened that phone records proved otherwise. He was not a foolish man. Whatever his enemies said of him, and the same instincts that had built his fortune slowly began sounding alarms he had spent years choosing to ignore. Meanwhile, the physical evidence around the case continued to accumulate in strange and troubling ways. Footage from the parking structure adjacent to the hotel revealed its own inexplicable 12-second gap in coverage, occurring at almost precisely the same moment as the ballroom blackout, a level of coordination that no amateur thief could have managed alone. A security guard who had worked the loading dock that night disappeared from his apartment less than a week after the theft, leaving behind an unpaid lease and a phone that had gone permanently silent. Around the same time, a young information technology contractor who had helped maintain the auction house's server infrastructure was found dead in circumstances the police initially ruled accidental. Though Ethan, reading the incident report with a professional's eye, noted several details that troubled him deeply. Each new discovery added another link to a chain that stretched far beyond a simple jewelry theft, revealing instead the outline of an operation with resources, coordination, and a willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose it. Victoria, watching her carefully constructed world begin to fray at its edges, felt for the first time since the auction a cold current of genuine fear beneath her composed exterior. Lena's private notes from that period, later shared with prosecutors, described a woman growing visibly thinner by the week, canceling social engagements she would once never have missed, and drinking alone in the evenings in a manner the household staff had begun to quietly discuss among themselves. Richard, still unaware of the full extent of his wife's betrayal, attributed her distraction to the stress of the scandal surrounding the auction house, and in a strange twist of irony, found himself comforting the very woman who had orchestrated the collapse of an innocent man's reputation. Victoria accepted his comfort even as guilt gnawed quietly at the edges of her composure, aware that every kind word from her husband was one more debt she would eventually have to answer for in a courtroom neither of them could yet imagine. That fear sharpened into something far more dangerous when Damian Cross finally made contact directly. Arriving unannounced at a private meeting Victoria had believed was still weeks away, he informed her, with the calm efficiency of a man discussing routine business, that their arrangement had entered its final phase and that he expected the diamond delivered according to the original schedule, regardless of the chaos unfolding around the Harrington name. It was during that conversation that Victoria finally understood the true architecture of the trap she had helped build, realizing with mounting horror that she had never been Damian's partner at all but merely a convenient instrument in a scheme designed to be discarded once its purpose had been served. Whispers reached her through channels she still maintained from her early years navigating the diamond trade, warnings that Damian had a long and well-documented history of eliminating loose ends once a transaction concluded successfully. The realization arrived with the particular terror of someone who has spent years believing herself the architect of her own fate, only to discover she had been someone else's pawn all along. Victoria began to understand, in the sleepless hours that followed Damian's visit, that the one person in New York capable of standing against a trafficker as ruthless and connected as Damian Cross was the very man she had destroyed in front of hundreds of witnesses. She reached out to Ethan through an intermediary, offering information in exchange for protection. But Ethan refused to meet her on her terms. He sent back a single message through Mason, stating plainly that he had no interest in helping a woman who wanted to trade partial truths for safety. That if she wanted his help, she would need to tell the entire story, every transfer, every forged signature, every lie she had told her husband across 20 years of marriage. Damien's visit had unsettled her so completely that she barely slept in the days that followed, replaying every conversation she had ever had with him, searching for the exact moment their arrangement had shifted from partnership into something closer to a leash. Tightening slowly around her throat, she understood now that men like Damien never truly needed partners, only tools, useful for exactly as long as they served a purpose and disposed of the moment that purpose expired. For the first time since her early 20s, Victoria felt something she had spent 2 decades avoiding entirely: the cold, unfamiliar sensation of being powerless in a situation she could not simply charm or manipulate her way out of. Victoria arrived at the meeting 3 days later, looking nothing like the composed socialite who had pointed her finger at Ethan beneath the chandeliers of the Ashcroft Hotel. She sat across from him in a quiet diner far from the world of auction houses and charity galas, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she told the truth without editing it for effect. She confessed to the debts, to the years of quiet theft from her own husband's accounts, to the arrangement with Damien that had spiraled far beyond her control, and finally to the calculated decision to frame Ethan because his competence had made him the single greatest threat to everything she had built. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her that her confession changed nothing about the consequences she would eventually face. But it might, if she cooperated fully, change whether she faced those consequences alive. What followed was a carefully constructed operation built jointly between Ethan, Mason, and a small task force from the Federal Bureau of Investigation that Ethan's old contacts helped assemble within days. Victoria agreed to wear a recording device and continue communicating with Damien as though nothing had changed, providing federal investigators with real-time insight into a network that had evaded serious law enforcement attention for years. Ethan, drawing on skills he had not used professionally in half a decade, helped design the trap that would finally bring Damien into the open, choosing a location he knew intimately from his years working the ports along the New York waterfront. The exchange was scheduled to take place inside a shipping container at a private terminal in Red Hook, a location Damien had used successfully for over a decade to move contraband gemstones without detection. Damien arrived that evening with the calm confidence of a man who had never once been caught in the act, flanked by 2 associates, and carrying a small case containing payment for what he believed would be the final piece of a transaction years in the making. Victoria stood beside the container as instructed, her hands trembling slightly beneath the sleeves of her coat, while overhead, unseen in the darkness of the terminal, federal agents watched every movement through thermal imaging equipment positioned across the surrounding rooftops. What Damien did not know, what he could not have known, given the years he had spent believing his old adversary retired, was that the entire terminal had been under coordinated surveillance for nearly 48 hours, every container, every vehicle, every shadow cataloged and cross-referenced against a case file Ethan had rebuilt from memory and instinct. The moment Damien opened the container to inspect the merchandise, tactical teams emerged from positions along the perimeter with a speed and precision that left no room for escape. Damien reached instinctively for a weapon concealed beneath his jacket, but the agents closest to him had anticipated the movement and subdued him before his hand ever cleared the fabric. His associates surrendered almost immediately, recognizing within seconds that the operation they had walked into offered no viable path forward. Inside the container itself, agents recovered not only significant quantities of trafficked gemstones, but also detailed financial records, documenting years of laundering operations that stretched across multiple continents, evidence that would ultimately implicate a network far larger than anyone involved had initially suspected. Among the recovered materials, hidden inside a false compartment built into a secondary case, investigators found the true Blue Phoenix diamond, confirmed through detailed forensic analysis to be the original stone rather than one of the flawless replicas that had circulated through the case for months. The recovery closed the final gap in Ethan's reconstruction of events, confirming beyond doubt that the diamond had been stolen and replaced weeks before the gala, that the blackout everyone had witnessed was nothing more than elaborate theater designed to provide cover for a crime already completed. Damian Cross, once believed untouchable by law enforcement on 2 continents, sat handcuffed on the concrete floor of a shipping terminal, undone finally by the very agent whose career he had once believed himself to have destroyed. Mason stood nearby as the scene settled into the quiet, procedural aftermath that always followed a successful operation, watching Ethan review the recovered evidence with the same unhurried focus he remembered from years earlier. Someone from the federal team remarked that they had not seen a takedown executed with such precision in a long time, and Mason found himself agreeing, though he kept the thought to himself, aware that Ethan had never been the kind of man who wanted praise for doing what he considered simply his job done properly. Victoria remained seated inside a nearby vehicle, flanked by 2 agents, watching through the window as the man she had once framed walked calmly across the terminal, the weight of a case finally closed, settling visibly across his shoulders for the first time in months. The trial that followed drew even greater public attention than the original theft had months earlier, as prosecutors methodically presented evidence that dismantled the narrative the media had so eagerly constructed around Ethan Cole. Footage previously believed lost was recovered from an auxiliary backup server Ethan himself had identified during his investigation, revealing the true timeline of the diamond's disappearance weeks before the gala rather than during it. Financial records subpoenaed from 3 different jurisdictions traced the offshore accounts directly to Victoria's signature, each transfer time-stamped and cross-referenced against communications recovered from Damian's seized devices. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through the manipulated camera loops, demonstrating precisely how the footage had been altered to create the illusion of Ethan's guilt on the night of the auction. Victoria took the stand during the 3rd week of the trial, her voice steady but hollow, as she confirmed under oath every detail of the scheme she had orchestrated, from the initial debt to Damian Cross, through the calculated decision to frame an innocent man in front of hundreds of witnesses. She admitted that she had chosen Ethan specifically because his skill made him dangerous to her plans, never once imagining that the very expertise she feared would ultimately become the force that exposed her completely. Richard Harrington sat in the courtroom gallery throughout her testimony, his expression unreadable, a man watching 2 decades of marriage dissolve into a catalog of lies delivered in his wife's familiar voice. When the judge finally called for a recess, he remained seated long after the room had emptied, staring at nothing, absorbing a betrayal too large for any single moment to contain. Public opinion, which had once condemned Ethan with the swift cruelty reserved for convenient villains, reversed itself just as quickly once the truth emerged in full. The same headlines that had once branded him a disgraced federal agent turned thief now described him as the man who had single-handedly unraveled an international diamond trafficking network while clearing his own name in the process. Lena Foster's investigative series, published in 3 parts across several major outlets, detailed not only the mechanics of the crime but the quiet, methodical brilliance of the investigation that exposed it, cementing Ethan's reputation in a manner far more permanent than the fleeting outrage that had once surrounded his arrest. Strangers who had once shared his mugshot with contempt now spoke his name with something closer to reverence, though Ethan himself seemed largely indifferent to the shift, having learned long ago that public opinion was a poor foundation for anyone's sense of worth. Victoria was ultimately convicted on multiple counts, including grand larceny, conspiracy, and financial fraud, sentenced to a lengthy term that would keep her away from the world she had spent 2 decades constructing around herself. Damian Cross faced federal charges spanning trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy across multiple jurisdictions, his network dismantled piece by piece as prosecutors leveraged evidence gathered during the sting operation to pursue his associates across 2 continents. Investigators in Antwerp and Amsterdam opened parallel inquiries once American authorities shared the recovered financial records. And within months, 3 additional arrests followed in Europe, each one another thread pulled loose from a network that had taken Damian nearly 15 years to rebuild after his first encounter with Ethan. Richard, humbled by a betrayal he had never seen coming, sought out Ethan personally in the weeks following the trial. Arriving unannounced at the modest office Ethan had begun renting near the waterfront, he apologized without excuse or hesitation, acknowledging that his own fury on the night of the auction had contributed to a public rush to judgment that nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. And he asked, with genuine humility, whether there was anything he could do to make amends. Ethan told him there was nothing to repay, that Richard had simply trusted the person closest to him, which was neither foolish nor unusual, only human. He explained that the failure belonged entirely to Victoria and Damien, architects of a scheme built specifically to exploit that very trust, and that Richard bore no more responsibility for his wife's deception than any spouse deceived by someone skilled at hiding the truth. The two men shook hands in that small office. An unlikely peace formed between a billionaire who had lost his marriage and a former agent who had nearly lost everything else, bound together by a shared understanding of how thoroughly one person's lies could reshape another's entire life. In the months that followed, Ethan made a decision that surprised many of the people who had followed his story, declining several offers to return to federal service despite his complete exoneration and the renewed respect his name now carried within those circles. Instead, he founded a small private consulting firm, specializing in security and financial fraud prevention, drawing on both his federal experience and his years working within the elite world of high-value auctions and private collections. The firm grew quietly but steadily, built entirely on reputation rather than advertising, as museums, auction houses, and private collectors across the country sought out the man whose meticulous investigation had exposed one of the most sophisticated theft operations New York had seen in a decade. He hired a small team, mostly former colleagues he trusted, and built something deliberately modest, a firm designed around precision rather than scale, much like the man who had founded it. Mason left the police department 18 months later and joined that small firm as a partner, drawn by the same quiet satisfaction he had once found in federal work, the sense of solving a problem thoroughly rather than simply closing a file. Lena continued her career in investigative journalism, occasionally consulting with Ethan on stories involving financial fraud among the city's wealthiest families. An unlikely friendship formed in the wreckage of a scandal neither of them had expected to define their careers so completely. Richard eventually sold 2 of his 3 towers and stepped back from the public eye almost entirely, choosing instead to fund a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of financial fraud and identity-based crimes, a quiet penance for a trust he felt he had misplaced for far too long. 1 year after the night, the Blue Phoenix disappeared beneath the chandeliers of the Ashcroft Hotel. The auction house hosted another gala, this one smaller and more carefully guarded, though no less glamorous in its execution. Ethan received an invitation not as security staff working quietly at the edges of the room, but as an honored guest, asked to speak briefly about the importance of due diligence and integrity within an industry that trafficked daily in objects worth more than most people would earn across a lifetime. He stood at the podium beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed his public humiliation, addressing a room filled with many of the same faces that had once watched him led away in handcuffs without protest or doubt. This time, when he finished speaking, the applause that followed carried none of the suspicion that had once surrounded him, only genuine respect earned through months of quiet, careful work that had ultimately spoken louder than any headline ever could. A new diamond sat displayed beneath soft light near the center of the room that evening. Smaller than the Blue Phoenix but no less carefully guarded, its case now fitted with security systems Ethan himself had helped design in the aftermath of everything that had happened. Guests who passed the display paused to admire it, unaware of how close another gemstone had once come to vanishing entirely into a network of lies and greed, and unaware of how thoroughly the man standing quietly nearby had once dismantled that very network with nothing but patience and careful attention to detail. Ethan watched the room with the same calm stillness he had carried on the night everything began. No longer a suspect, no longer a headline, simply a man who understood better than almost anyone else in that glittering room how easily appearances could deceive and how much work it sometimes took to restore what a single lie had nearly destroyed. A liar can steal a diamond, but truth, given enough patience and the right kind of mind pursuing it, refuses to stay buried forever. And for a man who once hunted criminals for a living, every trap, no matter how carefully built, eventually leaves something behind.